Orion Taraban is a clinical psychologist and one of the fastest growing names in the relationship space. In this video, we talk about how you can be more attractive and how you can get and maintain the relationships that you want. What makes modern dating challenging for men?
There's a number of things. I think, first of all, what makes modern dating challenging for a lot of men is their over-reliance on dating apps. We know that in the last 10 years, the number of relationships that have been initiated through apps has just skyrocketed. I think more than half of new marriages, the couple met on an app. And that's up from just 10 years ago. It was maybe like 15%. So it's like over tripled in the last decade. And I think it's probably still going to increase for some time to come. There's nothing terrible about dating apps, but it is generally not a great idea to use dating apps exclusively. If people are going to use apps, I think that it should be just one avenue among several different possibilities. So I think too many men are exclusively relying on dating apps. And that's a problem for men because the odds are just so stacked against them on those platforms. Most men are unattractive. And we know from the revealed behavior of women on apps that the vast majority of women give the vast majority of swipes and likes to like the top 15% of men. If you're in the vast majority of men, like let's say the bottom 80%, you're going to get very few, if any, matches and likes on a dating app. And that's probably going to make you feel really frustrated and hopeless and despairing over your likelihood of ever meeting a woman on one of those platforms. I don't think it's the only way to meet a woman, so that's part of the issue. And I think that there are things that you can do as a man to make yourself more attractive on a platform like a dating app. But to really kind of treat it, if you're going to go that route, as if it were kind of a professional brochure. Like if you were going to launch a business and you were going to have a glossy brochure or a website to promote who you were and what you did, you would hire professional photographers, you would hire a web designer, you would put a lot of effort and attention into your design and your brand. You can't just like take some 6 blurry photos of you and your buddies, slap them on the platform and expect that that's going to get the business rolling in, as it were. So I think that if you are going to go down that route, you need to treat it like it's a professional it's the first impression that people are going to get of your brand, and even think of yourself as a brand when you're marketing yourself to women online. Mm-hmm. A lot of people, men and women, don't like these words. They don't think that you should have to market yourself or to have some sort of brand. And whether you should or shouldn't, it does seem to impact effectiveness and outcome with respect to dating. Like it works. So to my mind, the morality or the oddness of this is irrelevant on some level. This is what works. And if you want to have greater success on these platforms, that's kind of what you do.
The rise of dating apps and social media has impacted dating a lot.
Oh, sure.
Particularly, as you said, where the odds are stacked against you as a man. And I think that's reflective of how now in the modern social media world, things are more competitive than ever.
Well, that's one of the other avenues is that there's traditional dating apps and there's also social media. You can attract women as a man through social media. You can't if you just have 100 of your buddies following you on Instagram, but there's no reason why you can't build a social media presence on one of the major social media platforms. And if you're starting from zero, I would recommend you do it on Instagram because that's where the women are.
Mm-hmm. How has social media changed the dating game?
Well, significantly. I mean, it's incredible. Through social media, through an app like Instagram, you can more or less have direct access to almost every other person on the planet. It doesn't matter if it's a celebrity or an athlete or a politician. I'm sure even some royals have Instagram accounts, and they do read their DMs. They might not respond to their DMs, but these folks are still looking at their social media just like you and me. Mm-hmm. So the fact is that the average man and the average woman now has a pathway to initiate communication with some of the most powerful, attractive, and desirable people on the planet. These are people that you just would never be able to circulate among even just 10 years ago, before these social media apps just went wild, right? Like, people would just circulate in totally different universes, and it would be next to impossible to get an introduction. Nowadays, you can just slide into people's DMs. So this has changed things because, as I mentioned in the book, there are no small ponds anymore. For a long time, it was okay to be a big fish in a small pond. You grow up in your little hometown. You might be the high school quarterback. You might have a respectful small business. You could be the most eligible bachelor in town. That doesn't matter anymore because the rest of the world is so accessible, not just, like geographically. You can travel around the world in a day, but interpersonally, like, you can have access to pretty much every other man or every other woman on the planet. So when folks are interested in potentially partnering up, they're not just thinking, who's the most eligible bachelor or who's the most attractive lady in my hometown? They're now comparing that man and that woman against all the other men and women that they see on TV, on Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. So everyone is swimming in one gigantic ocean in today's day and age. So each man is competing for the girl next door with every other man on the planet. And every woman is competing for the most eligible bachelor in her hometown against every other woman on the planet, more or less. And that's really tough because most of us aren't the most, there's always a bigger fish, you know what I'm saying? We're not whales, most of us. So that can also lead to folks feeling hopeless and despairing, usually more men than women. This is because it's easier for a woman to slide into a man's DMs and get a response than vice versa. And women can actually access very desirable men, especially if they're interested in providing a sexual opportunity. And the reverse isn't really true.
Yeah, I think that's something that has really impacted men, particularly in the way you were saying about how there are no small ponds. Like, a long time ago, before there was social media, if you were, say, a successful lawyer in your small town and maybe making $1 million a year, driving a nice car.
That'd be huge. Can you imagine $1 million?
Yeah.
Whoa.
If a girl met you, you would be the best she could ever get. Like,
sure.
Because she only has access to the people that she can meet in person. But now that you have social media and Instagram, a girl could be DM'd by some guy in New York who is a major high roller. And now that lawyer, when you compare them to, A-list celebrities, now that lawyer, instead of a 10 out of 10 in terms of what the girl could do, he might be a 6 out of 10 if you put that guy in New York competing against all these other big fish.
Could be, exactly. There is, though, a danger that women conflate a man's willingness to engage with her sexually with a man's willingness to commit to her long term. And so that can create some difficulties for women. They might think, oh, I'm getting DM'd by this multi-million-dollar A-list celebrity in New York, which makes the small-town lawyer look like a 6. But the A-list celebrity is unlikely to ever commit to her long term. So depending on her, let's say, relationship goals, those valuations might shift. And sometimes women eventually, we can talk about this too, but they eventually say, I can't target the really attractive men anymore if I want to get married and have a family. Now, that doesn't make the men that they settle for feel any better, because those women weren't really settling to begin with, because the men that they might have found more attractive weren't ever going to offer them commitment long-term anyway. So they weren't really an option. They looked like an option. They had access to that man. Maybe they were even sleeping with that man, but it wasn't going to happen for them. But a lot of women don't know that.
And I think that's one of the challenges that has come up in modern dating, is that
Sure.
men and women aren't able to get what they want, and they are less likely to actually get into relationships because of that. How would you describe that?
Well, we know that fewer people are getting into relationships in the developing world, like the stats are in the book in chapter 12. So there are fewer people getting married. There are fewer people entering into relationships. There are even fewer people among Gen Zs who are even having casual sexual relationships. So like especially among younger cohorts, men and women seem to be doing less and less with each other. And I think that's because we don't need as much from each other anymore. It used to be that the primary reason why people got married is because life was fucking hard, man. It was tough. And infant mortality was high, so you'd have 10 kids because 3 of them might pass away before they were 5, and you need a lot of hands on the farm. And we need to work together through our complementary skill sets to survive the winter. Mm-hmm. And there might only have been 3 other people that were eligible in your town, and you chose the least smelly one. You know what I'm saying? So It's like people did not have a lot of optionality. There was a great deal of social pressure to pair up and start families, and that was done so that the communities could have more people to farm and more people to make clothes and more people to do X, Y, and Z. We don't really need that at all anymore. Like, a man doesn't need a woman in 2024, and a woman doesn't need a man. We need lots of women around. Like, the human race would go extinct without a lot of women around. And women need a lot of men around to take care of all the infrastructure and make sure that civilization doesn't fall apart, basically. So we need men and women on the population level, but a lot of folks don't need an individual man or an individual woman in their lives because they can get those needs met themselves or through other types of relationships. So necessity has more or less been removed in the developing world, and there's a lot of positive and negative consequences to that. One of them is people pair up less often because in the absence of need, people generally get together because they want to, because of desire. So this is important for a lot of guys to understand because it used to be the case that you could be like a good man. You could be a solid provider. You could be the pillar of your community, you know? And you might not be the flashiest guy. You might not be the tallest guy. You might not have the biggest muscles, the richest guys, but you were a good man. And so you were going to be a good option for the women in your community. But most women today, they don't need that kind of protection or provision from a man. And so the good man often gets passed over for the attractive man because in the absence of need, there's want, there's desire. If I don't need you, then I'm only going to interact with you if I want you. And so that's why all of the characteristics and attributes associated with attraction are so much more important in today's dating game than, let's say, more traditional models. And that's really important to understand because there's a lot of folks out there that are just out of date. They haven't dated in the last 10 years. Maybe they've been married for 40 years. They don't understand what's going on in the world, and they can be very judgmental and shake their heads. And sure, there's some things to be not so thrilled about, but there's also opportunities that exist today that didn't exist even 10 years ago.
I think that is a key thing that has changed is the way that women look for relationships or what they look for in guys.
Sure.
And now that we've removed a lot of the stressors in the world that, you know, people used to have to contend with, you're left with just people just getting together because they want to, as you said, the attraction.
And on some level, if the fundamental premise of your relationship is desire, then it's rational to separate when the desire is gone. And that's another big reason why we see so many short-term relationships and high divorce rates, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, if the basis of this relationship was I want to be here, not that I need to be here, when the wanting stops, just go your separate ways. What's wrong with that on some level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so today we're going to be getting into some of the things that men can do to improve their odds in this new dating game.
Sure.
And the first thing we should talk about is what makes men attractive. So how would you define sexual market value?
Well, it's actually a pretty complicated construct. There's a whole chapter about that in the book. So I actually splice it in different ways. When most people talk about sexual marketplace value, I think they're talking about what I call normative sexual marketplace value, which is basically like each culture throughout a particular time and particular place has this sort of collective archetype for what it believes is an attractive man and an attractive woman. And a person's normalized sexual marketplace value kind of has to do with how closely they match with that collective archetype. It's like a goodness of fit. So, for example, in today's day and age, it would probably be, well, it'd be kind of like a supermodel. But even supermodels have changed over the last decades. Like in the 80s and 90s, they were rail thin and twiggy. Today's day and age, they're definitely a bit more robust, right? So big booty, big breasts, small waists, long hair, flat tummy. Different ethnicities even become more like faddish in terms of their attractiveness from one year or decade to the next. And the more a woman matches up with that archetype, the more that we consider her to be, let's say, conventionally beautiful, and she has a high NSMV. For a guy, it's definitely skewed more in recent years towards physical looks. Like, for better or for worse, as a guy, you could kind of get away with not being that physically fit or physically attractive if you were well connected, if you had money, if you offered a compelling lifestyle. And that's still part of the package, but it's become much more important for men these days to have the arms, to have the abs, to have some sort of fashion sense. But even more so, what seems to be most attractive to women in men is some degree of fame or reputation. That seems to be what they respond to the most. And that kind of makes sense in an attention economy. If we lived in wall-less cities during barbarian times, it would make sense for women to partner up with the best fighters, the best warriors. But we don't really have that in today's day and age. So what really kind of moves the needle and causes people to win is the amount of attention that they can control online generally. And again, older generations are not going to understand this and they're going to shake their heads, but that's the world that we're living in right now. And it will change in the future as well. So we don't need to despair. This isn't the end of the game. But a man who can control attention on that level, whether he's an athlete or a movie star or a social media personality, that's going to be extremely attractive to a lot of women.
So you talked about the looks and you talked about fame as being attractive to women. Some people have talked about, a few categories that go into creating what makes a man attractive to women.
Sure.
So like looks, money, status, and game.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on those categories, and would you edit that list?
Looks, status, money, and game. Fame is not quite the same thing as status, but it's similar. I think of status more of like in terms of power. And some of the most powerful people in the world are unknown and invisible. In fact, power is even more powerful when it's invisible. It's the people who are like pulling the strings behind the scenes that are safest and most in control of what's happening, right? So you could be sitting next to an extremely high status, powerful person and have no idea whatsoever. By the same token, you could immediately recognize a TikTok celebrity, a 19-year-old TikTok celebrity who has, 5 million, 10 million followers, but has no real power whatsoever. So those two things aren't quite the same thing. Is there anything else? That sounds pretty good to me. And I think of all of those things, because you're probably going to ask next.
Yeah. So the follow-up question is, how would you rank those in terms of importance?
In order to just get women, probably looks is most important. The pretty boys will always get attention. They might have difficulty keeping the attention, but most women are willing to give them a shot. I think close to that is game. And I think that might even surpass looks for most guys, because most guys can't be the top like 1% in terms of their physical attractiveness. Game is really important. And game is the ability fundamentally to engage a woman's emotions and to kind of lead her in the direction of a relationship. A lot of guys fall under the fallacy that if they just have status, if they just have money, if they just have a car, or even if they just have abs, that women are just going to line up to throw their bodies at them or to sign up for a relationship. And that's not how it works. I call those things attraction proxies. And they kind of stand in for what really does work to engage women, which is the ability to like touch them emotionally. And you basically have to do that with your words, with your communication more generally, facial expression, body language, touch, but mostly through your words. And there's a few different ways that you can have game. There's not just one way. There's not an infinite number of ways, I think, but there's probably like a half dozen reliable ways. And those things, no one thing will work on everyone, but everything will work on someone. Mm-hmm. So that's the other thing, is part of going down that road and developing game is kind of like figuring out what those 5 or 6 ways of playing are, and being able and willing to kind of switch between those tacks depending on who you're potentially dealing with. Because if you just have the one approach, you're probably just going to have to do massive action and get in front of a lot of women until you find the one that really resonates with that one approach. Or you can have multiple approaches, be masterful and flexible, and be able to switch among those approaches based on the feedback that you're getting from any particular woman.
I like what you were saying about the looks part. I think that's something that's changed, as you mentioned before.
Hugely changed.
Particularly for 2 reasons. I think, first of all, the fact that the landscape has changed in terms of people's needs. So women no longer need a man to provide for them, to pay their rent, as like before, when
they still would like a man to pay their rent,
exactly.
But they don't need a man to pay their rent.
Exactly. It's the difference between wanting and needing. So now that they're able to support themselves and be successful, and in often cases even more successful than men, they don't necessarily need that money part of the equation anymore. So the looks part becomes more important.
It does. Though if you are incredibly wealthy or high status, that still definitely works. The idea is basically that most women will not entertain a relationship that doesn't significantly improve their quality of life somehow. And there's plenty of women who are making 6 figures. According to some recent research I read, in some major urban centers like London and New York, childless women under 30 are out earning childless men under 30 for the first time in history. It's not a significant disparity, but the fact that it's a disparity at all is kind of incredible. That said, if a guy came along and he had tens of millions of dollars, that is, that's 100x. So that's a significant improvement. And I think a lot of women would at least entertain that as a possibility.
Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up is also how social media has made interactions more superficial in a lot of ways.
How do you think?
In that a lot of how we come across other people is through our social media. So the way you look has more of an importance in how you might, if you're meeting people online, for example, how you look on Instagram or on your dating apps, if people are using that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, though. It's like I was talking about, whether you're using a dating app or Instagram, you kind of want that to be the glossy brochure for who you might be getting if you were to sign up for a relationship with you. With women, it's very important to have extremely beautiful shots of their face and their body. Men, that's also useful, not as important. With men, what I often counsel them to do is you want to have, first of all, fantastic pictures. So they should be on an SLR camera with good lighting. Like it shouldn't be just something blurry and casual, right? And the idea is not only should the man in the picture look as attractive as he possibly can be, but the various photos on the profile or on the social media profile, the dating profile, the social media profile, should represent different facets of his life. As I talk about in the book, men kind of want the Barbie doll and women kind of want all the shit the Ken doll comes with. And so the idea, if you're a guy, is to have these different shots where it shouldn't be a lie, but it could be a slightly exaggerated version of your life that says, okay, like take you, man, I just met you, but like you're a very interesting, multifaceted person. You have the YouTube stuff. You have you're a medical doctor. You have the bodybuilding. Who knows what you do in your spare time? Maybe you volunteer at an animal shelter or something like that. So it's like, wow, you get all these different versions of Bill, and the picture should basically be evocative so that the woman might think, oh, I could see myself in these pictures next to this person doing those things. Because that's like the Bill experience. That's all the shit the Bill doll comes with. And that's kind of what a lot of women sign up for, is the whole package, the lifestyle. You don't need money for that. Money certainly helps. It's much fucking easier to do that when you have money, but you don't if you don't have money, you don't have money, right? And that's good because you don't necessarily have to have money to have an emotionally compelling lifestyle, but you need to have a vibe. Like, what's your vibe? And what are some vibes that you can have without money? Like, you could be kind of a struggling, passionate artist. Like, that's something that you don't need a lot of money for. Doesn't work on a lot of women, but nothing works on a lot of women, right? But it will work on some women, especially if you dial in your image and your brand. What's another one that doesn't cost a lot of money? Like a cozy vibe. A lot of those women that you probably interviewed in front of the club where they're in the 5-inch heels and the skin tight dresses, they're there because they really honestly think that they're going to meet their husband, or they could meet their husband that night. And their dream is that they don't have to put on the heels anymore and the skin tight dress and go out to the club. Like, they're there so they don't have to go there anymore, right? So you can just cut to the chase and say, like, hey, we can have this kind of cozy, intimate vibe where, we got the fireplace, we've got the blankets, everything's kind of, the soft music is playing, everything is just sort of sweet and intimate. Like, that will work on some women. It won't work on all women, but nothing works on all women, et cetera, et cetera. So when you have money, you can play more varied games with the lifestyle that you're presenting to women, and that tends to be more interesting as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to go in a little bit into the roles that each of these categories play.
Sure.
So what role does money play in dating as a man?
Oh man, it's such a double-edged sword, right? It's very confusing right now because, as I was just mentioning, women are doing just as well, in some cases better than men in the money department. They don't need a man to buy them dinner or to pay their rent. You might, if you're only making 6 figures a year, you might need a double income in order to buy a house in certain markets, like LA or San Francisco or New York. Just earning 100,000 is probably, you're never going to be able to do that in certain places. So it's still useful in some contexts, but it doesn't seem like it's as necessary as it used to be. That said, we know from the statistics that when a woman earns as much or more than the man, there's very poor outcomes associated with that relationship. Like, I think that man is 3 times more likely to be on erectile dysfunction medication. They are, I think, full twice as likely to get divorced. Their professed marital satisfaction is significantly lower. It seems, according to the research, that both men and women are happier when the man earns significantly more than the woman does. And what is that about when you don't need the money, right? Is it just that we're too constrained by our socially invented gender roles and we just need more re-education with respect to that? I mean, that's one argument. I don't put a lot of stock in that. There's probably some truth to it. Like I talk about in the book, attraction is culturally influenced and biologically determined. And I think the pendulum is starting to swing a little bit away from it's all culture, because that doesn't seem to fit with the evidence that we have. So this could be a vestige of not just traditional gender roles, which are another form of culture, but something about like a biological program with respect to what women respond to and what men seem to respond to. So I do think that money is still important, even if it's not necessary. Think of it like this. When you're going on vacation and you're looking around at hotels and you have 2 kind of comparable options and one has a swimming pool and one doesn't, you're probably going to choose the one with the pool, even if you never fucking get in the water. Like most people don't go in the pool at a hotel. But they choose the hotel with the pool. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
One of the best things you can do as a motel owner is to build a pool. It won't take much to take care of it because people won't use it very much. Maybe they'll take a picture of it. They'll dip their toes in. They just like having the pool around. It's nice to have a pool.
Yeah.
But certainly not necessary.
One thing that I wanted to bring up is that you will often see women gravitating towards men who are wealthy.
Yeah.
But does that attract the wrong type of women, or does it change the relationship dynamic between you and that woman in terms of her not being as genuinely interested in you?
Probably. I've never been a club guy, but I have had a number of conversations with people men and women who go to the clubs. And what I've heard is that in a lot of instances, if you don't pay for the bottle service, if you don't have like a table, women don't really you can try to approach a woman in a club and you're not going to get very far. And a lot of women, they just go over to those tables because they know that there's going to be free drinks and high times and lots of good things going on over there, right? So in certain contexts, it's very easy to signify that you're in a mood to spend money. Now, does that mean that everybody who buys bottle service in the club can afford to do so? Like, there's probably some guys who go into credit card debt trying to impress women at the clubs, right? And there could be multimillionaires who are just wandering around trying to see what the vibe is like. In some contexts, like in San Francisco, the billionaires look like homeless people. It's very difficult to tell who's who sometimes. Women do gravitate more towards men who have resources. That's certainly true. Generally, people want what they don't yet have, or even better, that they can't have. That's even more attractive, right? But that makes sense. It's like to want both means to desire and to lack, right? So we desire the things that we lack. And the more I have, the less I lack, which means the less I could possibly want from you, which is also part of the relationship or dating crisis these days. As people get more and more, they tend to lack less. And so they don't need other people. They don't want things from other people as much. And that tends to make the frequency of all kinds of relationships go down. I think it's no surprise that as GDP increases in every culture around the world for the last 100 years, birth rates have gone down. It's like the more people have, the less likely they're going to have families, the less likely they're going to enter into relationships, which is pretty much what you have historically had to do to have a family, etc. People are just content having more short-term relationships and more varied relationships, it seems. Does that answer your question about money? Did I get a little too off track?
Yeah, I think the bit that I wanted to drill down towards was, if someone is attracted to you because you're wealthy, does that affect the nature of your relationship or the quality of their desire?
Well, it can, but I don't think it necessarily has to. That would be sort of like leading with money tends to attract gold diggers. Let's just call a spade here. But having more resources, which means the ability to provide and to cultivate an emotionally compelling lifestyle and to have and enjoy the varied experiences that a person can have on this planet in 2024, those things require money, and women generally do respond to those things. Leading with money in a very crass way, if you bait your hook with that, you're generally going to get women who will use you for money. And that's kind of to be expected, because the men are basically saying, please use me for money. That's what I can offer. And I know what you can offer the woman in return, right? And I hope that we can kind of make a deal. I mean, this is also, in a softer way, potentially, this is seen in the rise of all these sugaring sites, which I'm sure you're aware of, right? So for those who don't know, sugaring is kind of like I don't know, is it escorting light? Could be. I mean, I do consultations with a number of men who have used sites like this, and according to them, it really runs the gamut from like straight up prostitution, where you're just exchanging a defined dollar amount for certain sexual services, to women who just sort of want to be even a more traditional relationship. They want to be taken care of. They want to have like a mentor, someone who could introduce them to different circles of life, who can provide good things. And in return, she'll be loving and sexual, which is basically a traditional marriage. That's a traditional marriage. Like there's nothing more sugary than a traditional marriage, which is, I will provide, I will go out to work and slay the dragon and earn the bread and come home, and you make my life kind of sweet and soft and be available to me. Like that is a traditional relationship. And everyone kind of knew what their gender roles were, you know, what was the fundamental basis of that relationship. And that's why in traditional relationships, when the man loses his ability to earn, it jeopardizes the relationship, because that was fundamentally what that relationship was predicated on. Just like today, when the relationship is fundamentally predicated on desire, when I lose attraction for you, that jeopardizes the basis of the relationship. So it's like, there was never a time, in my opinion, where people were just sort of like altruistic and motivated simply by the desire to love. And that's what caused them to get into the relationships that they did with the people they got into relationships with. People get into relationships where they can benefit and where they can derive value. But what benefit and value is changes from culture to culture and from person to person. But without that benefit or value, you would just sort of go on your way, I would think. So we can talk about how relationships today are so superficial, but when the guy couldn't provide anymore and that led to the end of the relationship, that's kind of superficial too. They just couldn't get divorced as much back then. That doesn't necessarily mean that their relationships were any better.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, is that men have to remember that they need to provide value. And you can't let yourself off the hook as a man ever.
You can't ever. Nope.
You can never just let go. And I think that's something where we have been raised in this Disneyfied version of love that we imagine as men, that love is going to be this unconditional thing, like the way your mother loved you. And
some people didn't have that, but other people might have gotten there. Sorry to interrupt.
That once you find someone, that you're done and you can just stop pushing.
Yeah, that's a really dangerous idea, both for men and women. But I did make an episode about this a while ago, that men's most romantic belief is, I can be loved for who I am. I think in their heart of hearts, most men would like to believe that that is possible and true. But I'm reminded of that quote from Chris Rock. What did he say? That children, women, and dogs are loved unconditionally. And men are loved on the condition of what they can provide. And on some level, that's just how the game is played. Is that fair? I don't know. It is what it is. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. The issue, though, is what value you can provide really depends on who you're dealing with. So many people are concrete about this. They think it's only about money, and it's not. Money is great. I'd rather have more money than less, but it's not the end of the story. So you can provide value in all kinds of different ways. You can provide value, first and foremost, as a guy, by being willing to wife her up and have kids with her. Because a lot of the most attractive men aren't going to be willing to do that. And that's what actually allows less attractive men to compete for the same women against more attractive men, because they're willing to give something that the woman values that the more attractive man can't or won't. They're going to resonate with that. It can create difficulties in the relationship. Again, I think this is a Chris Rock thing, where a lot of the problems that men have with their wives is fundamentally based on the fact that he's not her first choice. And the woman, on some level, doesn't accept that she couldn't win the more attractive man. She thinks that she's settling with the man that she got, but if she could do better, she would have. And there's this memory of being with other types of men, or a fantasy that will never be fulfilled, that causes some measure of resentment. That if the woman is uninsightful, she can use that against her own husband or her own boyfriend, as if he were responsible for catering to her fantasies and expectations.
That is something that is unfortunate, because a lot of guys don't realize that they're in that scenario, or they may not understand that, attraction works in that way, and they wonder what's wrong.
I have an episode that just came out. It's called The Feast of Crumbs. And in that episode, I try to explain why so many men end up in unsatisfying relationships. And the fact of the matter is again, most men are unattractive. Just by definition, because most people are unattractive, right? Attractiveness is more or less a normal distribution. And we can't all be on the right tail, right? So the vast majority of men are going to be unattractive. And combine that, when you're in your 20s, you typically don't have emotional maturity, you don't have money, you don't have stability, you don't have status, you don't have the ability to travel around the world or have these varied, interesting experiences. You're not really useful to women. The young men who can win the dating game in their 20s are the attractive men. They're the good-looking men, they're the tall men, they're the guys who just hit the genetic lottery and are still kind of coasting on their success from high school or college, right? And this is why some of the darker aspects of the internet with respect to intersexual relationships have so many disenfranchised, angry men, is that they're young, because it's very easy to feel angry and disenfranchised as a young man, because other guys don't want you because you don't have any skills or experience. You're not useful as a team member. You're kind of a fucking liability. It's like every cop movie. It's like, don't stick me with the rookie, man. Fuck, no, not with the rookie. You're with the rookie. Fuck you, chief. It's like no one wants to be with the rookie. And women don't want them, especially if they're not cute. It's like you can't take them out. You probably might still be getting high and playing video games. You don't really have your shit together. You're useless to men, and you have nothing to offer to women. It's going to be very difficult and lonely to be a young man. The issue is that changes. Like, attractiveness in men has something to do with physical attractiveness, but it's definitely not the whole story. Women are not as monomaniacally focused on physical attractiveness as men are, for better or for worse. It's becoming more important to be physically attractive as a man, but it's still not the most important thing in some level. So what that means is that there's other entries for a man to enter into that top 15% of eligibility as a sexual partner or a relationship partner. You can work your ass off and make some money. You can start a social media account and get some fame. You can work really hard on your fitness and your fashion and present a more attractive, interesting, exciting possibility, right? Like, a lot of women would love to be able to touch the muscles and the abs, and it's like it's exciting, just like a lot of men would like to be with women of certain dimensions, right? So there's other ways that men can enter into the top 15%, which more or less rotates. Like, the men in the top 15% today weren't in the top 15% 10 years ago, certainly not 30 years ago. Like, I had no idea I would be where I am today at 42 when I was 18 years old. Like, I didn't think I'd be alive at 40. You know what I'm saying? That's just kind of how my immature mind worked. So it's not over when you're 22 and lonely and struggling as a guy, but you might have to work for 10 years to make something happen and to notice that things start to change. And generally things start to change around 30. Because if a guy doesn't fuck up and he works hard and he plays his cards right, in that decade, he might actually succeed in being useful to other men and having something of value that he can give to women. Men start low and kind of rise, and then they dip near the end in old age, right? But for a long time, a woman is just so much more, the average woman is just so much more attractive than the average man at 18, at 21. That changes around 30. 30, according to the research, is where the average man's sexual marketplace value exceeds the average woman's sexual marketplace value for the very first time. And that's an enormous game changer. So what happens is, in the late 20s, early 30s, a lot of these unattractive guys who got passed over in their 20s, but who have been working really hard at developing other aspects of attractiveness to women, developing value that they can provide, their SMV is increasing. Women, they might have despaired of being able to get commitment from the attractive men that they've been spending time with. They might now also see what another 10 years is like. When you're 18, you're not even really an adult yet, to be honest. 10 years ago you were 8. Like, you don't really know what a decade feels like. But from let's say 20 to 30, you now have a full decade of your life as a conscious, mature individual. You kind of now know what 10 years feels like. And so you can be like, oh, in 10 years I'll be 40. And another 10 years after that, I'll be 50. It's like, oh, I can really kind of think about my life in the long term. And they think, well, maybe they mature a little bit more. They've gotten something out of their system. And they think, okay, well, it might be nice to have a family. It might be nice to have kids, or it might be nice to have these other experiences. So what I want, what I'm lacking has changed. So now what I value and I'm going to find attractive in a potential partner has shifted. And so put those two things together, and you have these unattractive men who are unaccustomed to any kind of female attention or interest. Suddenly they get their first crumbs of female interest. And the men are completely unprepared for it. They're like over the moon. And I think that these women often don't really like these men. They're not very attracted to these men, but they have what they want at that time. I think this is generally how men get used. And But these men are often very enthusiastic participants in their own exploitation. They love it because, again, they're getting more attention and attraction than they've ever had in their entire life. Let's leave aside the fact that it's 1/100th of what she was giving to another guy just 6 months ago or 6 years ago. The guy's over the moon. And for just like the bare minimum of interest and attention. And you might think, well, Orion, what's the problem with that? It's like, as an unattractive man, I'm getting more attention and interest than I've ever had in my life. That's good. Yeah, maybe she might want this other dude, but he wasn't going to wife her up. I was. So his loss is my gain. What's the problem? Like, I got the cutie that I wouldn't have been able to get. And I think the problem is that this works for a while. It works for 10 years, maybe 15 years max. And then the relationship tends to fall apart. And at that point, the man is now in his mid-40s, and he's now potentially with kids, with alimony and child support. And he's now entering into the dating market as a divorced person, which is a very different set of circumstances. And he's probably heartbroken and feeling betrayed because that's not what he signed up for. But the issue is that woman kind of used him for the ring and for the kids. And then once she got those things, what else was he going to give her except a severance package on some level? Because at some point, a man can give a woman everything that she wants. Like, there's not this infinite path. It's like, okay, think about dating. Okay, we date for a while, then we move in. So I can give her cohabitation and the stuff around that. And I can give her a ring and get proposed, and she can have all the parties and give her a wedding. Okay. Then I can give her a honeymoon, and then I can give her kid 1. Then I can give her kid 2. If I'm really crazy, I give her kid 3, But then then what? You could have another 50 years of marriage left, given how long people are living. So there's nothing in our culture about what's past that. There's nothing to look forward to. Mm-hmm. When you're single, you look forward to the wedding. Okay, well, what if you've had the wedding? Well, you look forward to the kids and the bridal and the baby showers. Okay, you've had all that. Well, what else do you have? Mm-hmm. So at that point, people are only going to stick around if A, they're still very attracted to that partner, and or B, they have a deep, abiding love for that person. Mm. Otherwise, it makes sense that you just go your separate ways. But of course, that's not what that man was likely consciously signing up for.
I like what you were talking about in terms of how men will increase in value with time as they develop skills and develop their ability to provide value. When would you say men are at their peak?
Well, according to some research I've read, it's 50, which sounds a little old to me. But I would think that probably in their 40s, they're at their peak. Like all the actors who play James Bond are in their 40s, for instance. It's like that's where a man can do anything. He's knowledgeable and experienced enough to have all kinds of practical, real-world skills. He has some experience. Maybe he's carved out a name for himself in some discipline or field. He has money. He knows himself. He knows what works, what doesn't work, what he likes, what he doesn't like. He probably has some experience seducing women. He's not going to be nervous around women. This isn't his first rodeo, so he has confidence in this respect. This is really important because confidence is very much domain bounded. It's like I know guys who are extremely confident in their work. Maybe they do lots of surgeries, or they are doing billions of dollars worth of deals on Wall Street. But when it comes to talking to a woman, their heart is in their throat, and it doesn't transfer one to the other. So the way you get confident in anything is by doing it repeatedly and having success. It's not possible to be confident with women without having a lot of success with women. Mm-hmm. But women seem to expect confidence, sometimes without the experience, which is unreasonable. So I think that's pretty much when a man is at his peak. He's also still, if he's taking care of his body, he's still very attractive at that stage. He hasn't seen any signs of age. He's like a fully matured man in the prime of his life.
You'll hear people nowadays talking about how a man should grind throughout his 20s. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I saw an interesting quote from Alex Hormozy on this, where he basically says that you're going to misspend your 20s. And there's two, and I agree with this, that's why I'm bringing it up. there's like two ways that you can misspend it, according to him. One, you can misspend it through like partying and having fun and the diversity of experience, or you can waste it by grinding. And it's a waste either way, because let's say you take the path of fun at 30, you might have had all these experiences, you might have lived a lot, but now you're behind in respect to the material game of money and status and wealth. By the same token, if you grind in your 20s, you might actually have a pretty decent income or a license in a coveted profession or something along those lines, but you might also be like an interpersonal idiot. You might not have had any kind of relationships. You might not have experienced anything of the world. You might not even really know yourself. You've just been a worker bot for your entire conscious life, basically. Mm-hmm. I think that those people often end up sometimes having midlife crises further down the road, because they're like, I can't just work my whole life. I can't just do what other people expect me to do. That's what I've done my whole life. What mommy wanted, what my teacher wanted, what my wife wanted. I want to live. And they've 40, 45 years old. They've never lived a day in their life, potentially. So grinding has its place. I took the path of fun. I did not grind in my 20s. I was an actor. And so I lived a very bohemian and hedonistic lifestyle. And I got a lot of that stuff out of my system, you know? Could I have gone back and done it differently? Sometimes I wonder, but probably not. Like, based on who I was when I made those choices, I had to live that life for a while. Like, I couldn't have gone to grad school to become a psychologist at 20, 21. Like, that was just so different from who I was and what I wanted my life to be, that even if I somehow did it, I probably would have dropped out. I probably would have hated it. Like, things have to happen in their own time on some level. Now, some of my friends who went straight into law school and straight into med school, now they're experimenting with cannabis, with non-monogamous relationships in their marriages. They're finally starting to like do some of the things that I've done, you know, a bunch of times in my past. And I think it's a better look on a young person than an old person, but that's probably a little judgy. It's good that they're exploring and seeing what works for them. Sometimes, though, I did feel like I was a little behind because of that. Like, I really got my shit together, started to get my shit together at 28. And I changed career trajectories and started a new path. And it took another like 6 or 7 years before I started to get any kind of returns on that risk and that investment. And while I was in grad school, working for like $1 an hour at my internships, my friends were getting married, my friends were buying houses, my friends were like getting promotions and moving on in the world. And I felt like I was just so far behind or even stuck in some sort of stasis. At 30, for instance, I was the only friend in my friend group who wasn't like engaged or married. But at 40, half of those people are now divorced. So that has taught me that this idea of being ahead or behind is really bullshit. It's not true. Everyone truly is on their own path. I know that sounds cliche, but sometimes cliches have some truth to them. And the story keeps going on. So like, if the story ended at 30, it would feel like my life was incomplete and there were many things that I didn't yet do or have accomplished, but the story just keeps going on and on and on. So comparing yourself to others, too long didn't read, probably not a great idea.
As we were talking about, guys often will, improve themselves with time, and they will have more optionality as they get older.
Sure.
At least as compared to when they were, say, 18. And at this crossing over point, sort of around 30, guys start to find their footing and start to hit their stride and, really make gains. It's also the time when everyone around you is settling down. There's a lot of pressure from society or friends to, be in a long-term relationship or get married. A lot of people are getting married around that time. And they start to have their first interest from women. And it's very easy for them to just settle down with the first pretty girl who really likes them back.
Yeah.
And often those relationships don't end up working out, as you mentioned, with some of your friends. How should a guy know when to settle down?
Well, I think he needs to want to do that, first and foremost. I think a lot of guys get married and settle down, one, because of pressure coming from society vaguely, but generally from that particular woman. I had a private conversation with Logan Ury some years back. She is the head relationship scientist at Hinge, and she wrote a book called How Not to Die Alone. And she told me that in her opinion, behind every proposal is an ultimatum. Sometimes that ultimatum is explicit, sometimes it's not. But the idea here is either give me what I want or I can't waste my time in this relationship. I can't waste my time with somebody who's not giving me what I want. Mm-hmm. To me, that's very dangerous. Like, paradoxically, if I ever were to get married, and I probably won't, but if I ever were, I would get married to a woman who didn't need to get married or didn't want to get married. Like, the idea that a woman is going to, I mean, people want what they want. That's their right. That's not going to change. But if a woman basically says, I'm going to leave you if you don't give me a ring, mm-hmm. What she's functionally communicating is, I want what I want more than I want you. More than I want you in my life, more than I want to be in a relationship with you. I have no interest in that relationship. I mean, if I'm going to marry anybody, it'd be somebody that I felt truly and deeply loved me. And I don't think there's an ultimatum in that type of relationship, because love doesn't really ask for anything in return. Mm-hmm. Its one desire is to just remain in the presence of the loved one. And it's willing to surrender even that if it's in the best interest of the loved one. That's the truest sign that somebody loves, is that they're willing to surrender their claim to anything else and even to walk away from the relationship if it's in the best interest of the other person. If you love something, set it free, kind of a thing. But that's a very high bar. And most people are not in those types of relationships. We need to be honest. They're in relationships where they get what they want until they don't, and then the relationship begins to suffer, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that men should settle down when they want to, when it's ready for them. And for better or for worse, women are on shorter timelines than men, mm-hmm. especially if they want to have kids. So in general, I often suggest that men not even think about settling down for a long-term relationship until they're at least 35. 35 means that they're now moving into the real prime of their life. They might now have some experience with different types of women, so they know kind of what works, what doesn't work, what they like, what they don't like. They probably have better optionality at 35 than they did when they were 25. And they can settle down if it's something that's like intrinsically motivating to them. Not because it's what that particular woman that he happens to be dealing with at that moment wants. Because that is a complete surrender of frame. No matter what the relationship was like up until that point, when a man does that, he's basically saying, well, he's basically rewarding somebody for threatening to leave. And so all that really does is train the other person to know that if they really want something, they can just give an ultimatum and threaten the basis of the relationship. It also communicates tacitly who has more power. Because in that moment, when the man caters to the ultimatum, he basically says, I'm not willing to walk. But the woman says, I am. And one of them, in general, all other things being equal, the party who's more willing to walk, who wants or needs the other party less, is more powerful for various reasons. And that means that the relationship is going to be more and more on the woman's terms, which I don't think is great for a lot of men.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something that a lot of guys get wrong at every stage in the relationship. You know, even early in the dating process, it's often the man who is trying to chase down this girl to come on more dates. You know, can we text right away after the date? Can we hang out, 2 days from now? And they're the first one to ask for commitment, say, I want you to be my girlfriend.
Yeah. I've learned all of these lessons the hard way too. And a lot of guys are also good at maintaining frame up into a point, and then they deal with a really attractive woman to them, like hotter than they've ever had in the past, and a lot of their system and training goes out the window on some level. And I've made that mistake, so that's why I can say that without any kind of real judgment. We all have to make our mistakes and learn the hard way to some extent. But at this point, I've learned that no matter how attractive the woman is, I kind of need to have relationships the way I want to have them. And if it means that I have to surrender that in order to get any particular woman or keep her, then I'm probably going to be miserable and lose her in the long run anyway. Mm-hmm. I've lived that story. So it's like, if I do this, I'll kind of quietly be resentful. I'll feel despairing. It doesn't work for me. I'll be increasingly unhappy. It's probably going to lead to arguments and difficulties. And then eventually we'll break up. So why, like, if I can see with my telescope that it's a dead end 3 miles down the road, do I really have to walk all 3 miles to figure that out? Like, I'll just like, no, it's not going to work. I'll just turn around and find a different path, because there's some that will definitely go forward past that point. So to my mind, I have learned the hard way that it's more important for me to have the type of relationship I want and to not compromise with respect to that. And obviously that's not going to work for most women, but to kind of give women a chance to self-select in, because it will work for some women. And hopefully some of those women that it works with are women that are also attractive to you, and you can kind of move forward in that respect.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on the saying, right person, wrong time, in terms of what we were saying about a guy not being ready to settle down when he's young and kind of waiting until more of the mid-30s when he's really hit his stride?
It sounds like it has some truth to it. It probably doesn't have a lot of truth to it, because at a different time, it's going to be a different person. So it is on some level true that sometimes you can meet very attractive options, but maybe you're already in a relationship and you feel conflicted about ending the one and entering into another. Though generally, if the new opportunity is sufficiently attractive, people will do that, obviously, or they'll do both at the same time. But I think what they're basically saying is that I know this is an attractive package. This is a good product. I just don't need it. I just don't need it right now. Mm-hmm. You probably get that. I mean, when do you usually hear that phrase, right person, wrong time? What's the context?
Let's say a guy's on his come up and he's really focusing on building himself up, and he meets a girl that he likes,
okay,
and he's not sure if he should settle down with her.
Well, not sure is no. Mm-hmm. Not sure is no. I've learned that too. I think we can take that from Mark Manson, who basically says if it's not a fuck yes, it's a no. Some things are okay to move forward with some ambivalence because they're low stakes. These are decisions that probably are not going to impact you for very long. Like, that's something to keep in mind with respect to how long you should deliberate on a decision. It should be proportional to how long that decision will affect you after you choose. That's why I'm not going to spend a lot of time in my cereal aisle trying to figure out which Lucky Charms or Golden Crisp. It's like I'll have to deal with that choice for a few days at most. Mm-hmm. So it's like, this seems good enough. I'll throw it in the cart. Choosing the wrong person will make your life absolutely hellacious and has long-term consequences for your emotional health, your financial well-being, your relationship options in the future. It's a huge deal. In my opinion, you should not move into that choice if you're ambivalent. I think that's true for both men and women. You have to really want it. Now, that said, no one is going to be perfect. Like, waiting until you find someone that you have absolutely no doubts about, that you're 100% convicted in your decision, that's too high of a threshold. But you should feel, as a guy, it's like, you know what? I feel pretty good about this. I feel like I like this girl. I've tested her out. We've been through some things together. I think we're aligned in about what we both want. I think we can do it. Yeah, it's probably going to be tough sometimes, but yeah, I feel pretty good. Like, that's about as good as it gets. Mm-hmm. And if you're not feeling that way, I don't think you should move forward.
I agree. I think that a lot of people stay in relationships that aren't good for them, or
at least. I see that all the time, man.
And I think it's funny because when I speak to my friends, I'm always the proponent of breaking up. I'm a big fan of, like, if there's something going wrong.
Do you just hate love, Bill? I mean,
Exactly.
What's the problem with you? You're just so cynical and cold-hearted.
I get that all the time. People are like, why are you so negative, Bill? And I'm like, when I hear them telling me stories about, oh, this is going wrong, we're fighting all the time about these things, and I see red flags or I see things not being ideal, I just think that people should be more ready to just drop things and just continue looking, because as you said, things are just going to get worse with time.
They often do. They don't always, but they often do. I think, especially if there's no kids, and especially if you're not married, if you're just dating each other, this is like the easiest, best time of your relationship. There aren't any real obligations or responsibilities at this stage. You're still kind of new to each other's bodies. You're still young and healthy. It's like, if you can't fucking figure out how to get along now, you should not be adding additional stressors and restrictions and contracts and things like that. That's a terrible idea. Yeah, I think a relationship should make your life better. There's absolutely no reason, certainly, to stay in like an abusive or toxic or exploitative relationship. And if you guys can't figure out a way to get along, just shake hands and go your separate ways. We tried, wasn't a good fit. Doesn't mean you're a narcissist or that you're a toxic woman. It's like, we're just not good fits for each other. And don't waste any more time, because you have less of it than you think.
Yeah, talking a little bit more about the mechanical parts of dating. I think people don't talk about how a lot of relationship and dating is actually a skill set.
Totally.
How can men improve their dating skills?
By dating. Like, there's no way to improve a skill except by doing it. You can't read books, though I'm sure dating coaches and programs are a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? They don't, and this is part of why so many people, I think rightly, find pickup to be cheesy or sleazy, is that when it's misapplied, it's just like, learn these lines, or here's a protocol for escalation with respect to touch. And everything becomes like this protocol and systematized. And that one, I don't think that what works for you is going to work for me. We're different men and we have different strengths. And what works for me today might not have worked for me even a year or so ago, right? And might not work for me a year or so from now. And it certainly doesn't work on every woman. There is no like master key to just unlock any woman's secrets and mysteries, as it were. You get better by talking to women, going out with women, practicing escalation under different circumstances, being willing and able to seduce confidently when the moment is right. And then also, if you want to have longer term relationships, what it's like to actually relate to somebody and keep the interest alive after the honeymoon has worn off. A lot of guys are really monomaniacally focused on the initial stages of game, getting laid, basically. It's like, okay, I get it. It's nice. And some of these men are extremely successful at that. They have all kinds of women just falling in love with them left and right. But it's just a trail of broken hearts with this guy, because he doesn't really fucking know what to do after that. It's like, I never thought I would get this far. It's like, are you still around? After 3 months, that's generally when the woman starts to kind of wake up to what she's reeled in on some level. And often things that begin in a very passionate flame tend to implode in some spectacular catastrophe as well, 2 or 3 months down the line. So you have to, to be a good boyfriend is a skill. And guess what? You have to fucking be a boyfriend to do that. And you also can't replace it from one to the other. Like, you can't just swap out girlfriend A for girlfriend B. It's like, what works for A isn't going to work for B. And so you kind of have to learn like which parts of relating to women are more or less universal and which parts are more or less dependent on the specific individual involved. And these are things that you can get better at. And it's fun to get better at this. It's certainly more fun to get better at this than doing your taxes. I mean, why not?
Agreed. Yeah, I think one challenge that some guys face is that they may have a lot of success in the initial phases of a relationship, just getting on a date or starting off that relationship, but they don't have a lot of success in long-term relationships. And especially after you get married or enter something really long-term and serious, they end up losing that attraction later on.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's harder to, if having confidence and mastery requires experience and repetition, then obviously it's harder to become skilled at long-term relationships because they just take more time. And so you have fewer repetitions, like by definition, unless you're having multiple long-term relationships simultaneously. That's the only way that a guy can really grind out skill with respect to that. There is one other possibility, which is, I think that sometimes marriage and long-term relationships can work when you just like marry your high school sweetheart or something like that, where there's 0 points of comparison. Like, I'm the only person you've ever had. You're the only person that I've ever had. So we don't even know if we're doing it wrong. We don't know if we're doing it right. We also don't know who we are. Like, I'm so glad I'm not married to like my high school girlfriend, right?
Yep.
It's, geez Louise. But hope she's doing well. But it's like, the idea here is I don't even know who I was. How could I possibly be making an appropriate decision about what I will want 10 years from now, 40 years from now? And so a lot of folks who do marry young, they're protected by this sort of like, I guess, lack of a basis of comparison and naivete, which has a guardianship to some extent. But they don't fucking know what they're doing. They're not emotionally mature yet, and they tend to have to like battle it out when they do that. And if they make it, then they kind of like have learned to fit into each other's lives. That's another thing. When you kind of are younger, people are still fairly malleable. Like, I'm not malleable at 42. Like, I am pretty much who I'm going to be. You know what I'm saying at this point? I know what my strengths are. I can try to shore up some of my weaknesses, but you know, they might not also be going anywhere. So as people age, they kind of become more rigid and they have more unique little jigsaw outlines. And so it's harder to find what fits exactly with that. And so whereas when you're younger, you're kind of smushy, and so it doesn't always feel good, but you can kind of like push each other together, and then you'll harden, and maybe it's a good fit that way. So there's a few ways to do marriage and long-term relationships. There's not just one way to do anything. And that can work for some people.
We wanted to talk a little bit about older guys dating. How does the dating game change for older men?
How old are we talking about here?
Let's say after 40, after 50.
Well, 40 is great. I mean, dating in my 30s was easier than my 20s. And I have plenty of optionality in my 40s. So I think as long as guys play their cards right, dating generally gets better and easier with time. You have more of what more women want, and you have more experience and confidence to give it to them. The issue with dating later is that, unlike me, most single guys who are in their 40s and 50s who are dating are divorced, and generally divorced with kids, which definitely changes the game. Not as much as if you're a 40-year-old woman with kids. That's much more difficult. A dad, a divorced dad, is largely a benefit to a lot of women, because again, one of the primary hurdles that most women want to get over is, I'm looking for a guy to have a family with, to settle down and to have kids. A divorced dad has demonstrated proof that he's willing and able to do that. So on some level, it's like, oh, you like kids, you have kids, you're a family guy, great. That's kind of what I want. Now, whether the guy wants to have more kids in his 50s with somebody new is another question. Sometimes they do, oftentimes they don't. And those same women who found the fact that he was a father attractive initially might end up feeling envious or jealous of his children and his family by previous marriage. And so blended families and arrangements they just require more maturity to navigate. One of the possibilities of dating at that stage of the game, though, is you can potentially move beyond some of the crasser transactions that tend to bring younger people together. You see this especially in 50s and beyond. It's like, at that point, the women can't have kids, even if they want to. They generally have already had their families. So it's like, I don't need the ring. I've been married. I've had that experience. I don't need to do it again. I don't need more kids, or I can't have more kids. I have my own money. I have my own house. I know what I like. My life is pretty good. I don't really need anything from you. And so the idea here is, because younger people pretend they don't need anything from other people, but they still need some things, right? And so the possibility of dating at the older age is, I can just date you because I like you. I like spending time with you. And you can kind of prioritize the emotional connection. And every single consultation I've done with an older woman, they say that that's what they're looking for. I just want a real emotional connection with a man. Because they kind of have everything else, or they've had it anyway. And that's what they're lacking. That's what they want. So I think that's really cool that you can just be a man and a woman who are just two consenting adults who enjoy spending time with each other. And you don't have to get the government involved. You don't have to take care of the other person in some way. You don't have to be sure that you're constantly providing some sort of value because the other person is needy or desirous. You can just say, I like you, and we can keep doing this. And if we can walk together for a while, and if it doesn't work for either one of us, we can say goodbye. It's like, to me, that's kind of beautiful and loving and mature. But on some level, I think people can only get there if so many of their other needs and wants are met. And for better or for worse, men want and need things from women, and women want and need things from men. And that's why they come together generally.
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, that is the model of a relationship that people want, should be striving for. But it's also complicated, as you said, by the things we want at a certain phase of our lives. And also what we were talking about earlier about how I think often a relationship is moving towards something. Like you're always moving towards getting married or having kids, and people have this sort of joint activity together. But how do you disentangle that from the actual connection that you have with someone? Like, does this person actually like me for me?
I don't know. It's hard to do. I think that people use the word love incorrectly all the time. I do believe in love, and I kind of disentangle some of those threads in the book. But the way that most people use love, it kind of means I get a lot of what I want and a little of what I don't. Like a person or an option or a product or a service or a restaurant, it's like, what do people love? I love this. It's like, I get a lot of what I'm looking for, and I don't have a lot of liabilities. Like it's great food and it's not very expensive. It's like, I love that fucking restaurant, you know? So a lot of what people feel is tied up in their perception of value. That's what I talk about in the first chapter of the book. Like, desire and value are the same thing experienced in different ways. Value is a rational calculation, usually unconscious, and that gets like transmuted into an emotion which can motivate us into action. Okay? A lot of what goes into the calculation of value is beneath the threshold of awareness and is very complex. And so our consciousness kind of like pushes that down and transforms it into an emotion that has these impulses to act in certain ways, so we can like take advantage of the outcome of that calculation without being bogged down in the calculation itself. So I don't think those two things are inseparable. Is like getting what you want causes you to like someone more. Getting less of what you want causes you to feel frustrated or to dislike them more, right? So I don't think that they can be extricated from each other. But you can test that out. It's like a person really loves you, the longer they'll stay with you in not getting what they want. That can be a test. It's like a test of a man's interest is how much he's willing to give up, and a test of a woman's interest is how much she's willing to give. They sound similar, but they're not quite the same thing. And so, like, for example, if a woman is willing to give up having her princess fantasy wedding or even having a marriage contract, she probably really likes you, because those are things that are very desirable to a lot of women. I think that's also why you start to get a lot of ultimatums around the 30s. Is I think a lot of it is FOMO. And I think women see their friends having babies and parties, and they want to have those things too. And on some level, if this is potentially their one and only life on this planet, and I think what modern women want more than anything else is the diversity of experience, they're going to feel like they've missed out on something important potentially. Is it that important? I don't know. But it feels that way to some women. Why not me? That's not fair. I don't want to miss out on that.
Coming back to the dating process, does the game change if a man is looking for something casual versus serious?
Well, Oh man, this is going to sound bad, but it's like, it's very hard as a guy to lead with, I want a casual sexual relationship. Like, women, you can do an experiment as a guy. You get a profile on a dating site, fill it with very attractive pictures. You can just do it as a social experiment and see how many matches and responses you get when you say you're looking for a long-term relationship versus when you're looking for casual fun. And I guarantee your matches will probably go down at least 90%, and the types of women who respond to you will probably be less attractive. Does that mean that only 10% of women are open to having casual sexual relationships? No, that's not what it means at all. In fact, I would say most women right now are in some form of casual sexual relationship or situationship with somebody. So it's clearly something that they're willing to do, but it's rarely their preference. And if you lead with something that isn't a woman's preference, you're not going to get very far. So the trick to that is to, again, engage a woman's emotions. So it's like women will make all kinds of exceptions and compromises for the men that they really like and are very attracted to. But if you lead with the points of discrepancy between what you want and what she wants, she doesn't have any kind of emotional connection with you yet. And so it's just so much easier to write you off. Something that comes up again over and over again on like women's dating profiles: swipe right if you're a Trump supporter, for example. It's like, that's interesting. I guarantee that woman loves somebody in her life that's a Trump supporter. She might not know that person is a Trump supporter, but if she did, she probably wouldn't disown them either, unless she was really ideologically possessed. Why? Because she loves the person, has a shared history. There are things that she likes about him. And then she learned this other thing, which in the context of all that other data will cause her to potentially accommodate this one new fact. Like, you might know 99 facts about a guy, and one of them is he's a Trump supporter. So now that the relevance of that one thing is lower. But if you come right out of the gate on a dating app and say you're a Trump supporter, that's the only thing she knows about you, and it's not her preference. And so she's going to write you off. So in the beginning stage, it's important, whether you want a long-term or a casual relationship, to more or less at least seem to align with the woman's preferences, because women don't have any kind of emotional connection. They're generally dating strangers at this point, and they don't have any other pieces of information to kind of like reduce the salience of this one thing that they don't prefer. And so you're not going to get anywhere with those women. So I don't think as a guy, getting your foot in the door is pretty much the same, regardless of what you ultimately want. As a guy, though, what works for a casual lover probably doesn't work for the wife and mother of your children. Men generally want the hottest woman who's willing to have him. And that's the furthest they go with respect to their vetting process. But clearly what works for one generally doesn't work for the other. So I say that it's important to kind of treat the dating process like an extended hiring procedure, where you're basically collecting data points in different contexts over time to see, like, does this person have the characteristics, the traits, the attributes to perform the role that I would like her to have in my life? Just like when a company is looking to hire, they don't start with interviews. They start with a job description. They think about, because no company is going to hire just for the joy of having another employee around. You know what I'm saying? They're there because there's a problem that needs to be solved. There are things that we want to do, and that's why we're willing to invest in this person and pay this salary and bring them onto the company. So what do we actually want this person to do? Let's really dial it in. So these are their responsibilities. These are our expectations, and this is what they're likely to receive in return. If a company didn't define the role before they interviewed, every interview could work. Like, every person who came into their office, they could be like, yeah, I mean, we could maybe make something work for you. It's like, you seem really smart and ambitious and great. It's like, yeah, everybody works. But if you know, they need to have 5 years of experience. They need to know C++ programming language. They need to be bilingual. They need to have experience with Excel. They need to be willing to come into the office 3 days a week, et cetera. It's like, oh, clearly now 90% of the applicants we can filter out. Okay. Now it's really important to be accurate with what you need, because every time you put in an unnecessary expectation or responsibility, you might very well eliminate applicants who would be a really good fit for that role otherwise. So, and that's one way that both men and women, more often women, really fuck up in the dating process, is they put in unnecessary criteria. And so they tend to eliminate applicants, suitors, who would be actually very well suited for the job, the relationship they actually want to have.
What are some examples of unnecessary criteria
Height
that men have
men have on women? Yeah, it's not usually height. That's an unnecessary criteria that women tend to have on men. I don't know. I think men, frankly, could stand to have a few more criteria with women, to be honest. Like I said, most men are happy with what they can get, and they're so focused on how hot she is. And I'm definitely guilty of that. When I was a younger guy, like, I wouldn't care if she was a convicted serial killer, man. I'd be like, but that booty though, you know, it's like, I would find a way to I could change her. I could make it work, you know? So, I think that it's important for men to actually kind of expect things from their girlfriends and their wives. Like, that's a reasonable thing to do in a relationship, because the danger is they end up in these really asymmetrical, one-sided relationships. I call that being a ferry boat captain, which is a male sexual strategy. Just like a ferry boat is like a water taxi, you know, it takes their passengers where the passengers want to go. And that's how a lot of men approach dating women. They're basically saying, what do you want? Do you want a drink? Do you want a dinner? Do you want to go to Dubai? Do you want to go to this concert? Do you want to do this? Like hot air balloon ride? Like whatever you want, I can give it to you. That's what they lead with. And the issue is that can work, because giving someone more of what they want makes you a more attractive option to that person. So it can engage a woman's attention. It can't even succeed in getting sex or a relationship with that woman. The issue is that most of those men, whether they're aware of it or not, they eventually think that there's going to be some form of reciprocation. They eventually think, okay, I've done all these things for you. Maybe now you can do something for me. And that's not what that woman signed up for. It's like a taxi cab. You could be a taxi cab driver for 20 years. And after 20 years, if you turned around to the passenger in the back seat and said, hey, you know, we've been kind of going where you wanted to go for a long time. Do you think maybe just this once, I don't know, we could possibly go where I want to go? Maybe. She's going to get out of the cab. She's going to run away, because if you're a taxi cab driver, you never get to stop being a taxi cab driver. That's the basis of your relationship, is you take me where I want to go. That's why I'm here. If you stop doing that, I will leave the taxi cab and find another cab who's willing to do that. There you go. So that said, sometimes these men can, at least temporarily, and if they have the resources and the patience, indefinitely, at least have some degree of access to women that might be more attractive than they could otherwise get. Like I've said, all men pay, but the more she likes you, the greater the discount. Why is that? Because if she really likes you, if she's really attracted to you, if she really loves you, then just being with you, she's going to perceive to be a valuable experience. We really value being with the ones that we love. We really value being with the alpha guy or the hot lady, right? For better or for worse. When we're not getting those things, when I'm not in love with you, when you're not this super alpha guy or this really beautiful woman, well, what else can you do for me? Like, I don't feel it. Can you make my life better or easier in some way? Could you give me some sort of experience? Can you be instrumentally useful? Because there's an opportunity cost here. If I'm talking to you, I'm not talking to anybody else. If I'm relating to you, I'm not relating to anybody else. So what can you do for me? I don't feel like being here, but maybe you can engage my feelings by being useful or providing some kind of value. So that's how less attractive men can sometimes get access to women, by providing value and by taking them where they want to go. The issue is they never get to stop doing that. So I think as a guy, you have to be very honest with yourself. It's like, do I want to play this game indefinitely? Do I always want to be here and never in the back seat? And I think most guys, if they're honest, do want some degree of reciprocity, but they might not get it.
Yeah.
But it's their fault, because that's basically how they advertise their relationship. A taxi cab advertises itself as a taxi cab. I take you where you want to go. That's why he got a fare.
You mentioned that guys should treat the dating process like the hiring process. What are some ways that they could test someone for compatibility in a long-term relationship?
Sure. I think one of the things that you do is not be too explicit about what you're testing for. Just like in a job application or a job interview, the interviewer isn't going to just reveal all of the criteria and metrics for evaluating applicants, because that will increase demand characteristics. The likelihood that people are just going to say what they think the employer wants to hear in order to get the job. And the more attractive the job is, the higher it pays, the more high status it is, the more likely people are going to show the person what they think they want to see in order to get the job. That's just human nature. So employers have to be a little cunning and not reveal the criteria, and to not overly rely on direct questioning. Direct questioning is generally a really stupid way to get good information out of someone. If you were to ask both an honest and a dishonest applicant, if they were honest, you would hear yes from both people. And on some level, so that question is a bad question. It doesn't discriminate between these two groups of individuals, right? And I'm saying this because I think there's been I don't know if it's as popular as it has been, but there's a general trend in dating advice that's like intentional dating, where you should be very upfront and honest about what you're looking for and what your needs are and what your boundaries are and this, that, or the other. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea for a number of reasons. One is, the more desirable you are, the more likely I'm going to say whatever the fuck I think I need to say in order to get what I want, just like in these high status, high paying jobs. And it's also not a good idea because it really does make the relationship feel more explicitly transactional. And that's not what people like. One of the unspoken rules about dating is that it shouldn't feel like a transaction. And the more transactional it feels, the more it kind of kills the authentic, emergent emotional response, which is often what people want the most from their romantic partners. So just being that explicit, it takes all of the game and courtship and play and mystery and fun out of the process, and it makes it like, this is what I expect, this is what I offer. Actually, they generally don't say this is what I offer. They just say this is what I'm looking for. That's also really stupid because you have to understand that a lot of the dating process could also be something like a sales process. And any salesman learns very quickly that to get a sale, you can't lead with what you want. You have to lead with what the other person wants. Like, imagine getting a call from a telemarketer. You're like, hello. It's like, hey, Bill, am I talking to Bill? Hey, I really want to talk to you today about making my commission. I would really love to sell you something because I get 10% of it. Can you help me out here? And you'd be like, what the fuck are you? Get out of here. So, but if he was able to pitch you something very quickly that's piqued your interest and was an affordable solution to a problem of your life, you might actually talk to that guy. And his commission might not ever come up. You know what I'm saying? He's more likely to get the commission by never mentioning it and seeming to deliver value to you as best as possible. That's how salesmen become successful. So when a woman generally, or a man, is coming to a first date and saying, this is what I want to settle down, I want a family, I'm looking for a long-term relationship, I'm looking for casual sex. It's like, who gives a shit what you want? That's not going to lead to a sale. whether it's a night of passion or 40 years of matrimony. It's like you have to lead with what the other person wants. And that's tricky because you don't fucking know what the other person wants because they're generally a stranger that you just met off of a dating app. So it takes a while to figure that shit out.
What are some examples of qualities that you would test for when you were dating and how you did it?
The main things I think I can have a satisfying, loving relationship with a lot of different women. I don't think that there's a one. I don't even think that there's a type. It's like I feel like I've gotten better at loving and relating and women. So I don't think I could have that with any woman, but I could have it with a lot of women, I think. So to my mind, it's less about testing for positive attributes and more about making sure that there's nothing really negative and difficult about this person. You can't have certain relationships with certain people. If you want to have a peaceful relationship, you need a peaceful woman. Like you can't have a peaceful relationship with a woman who's dramatic or neurotic or a squeaky wheel or a victimizing person. Like it's not possible. If you want a loving relationship, you can't have that with a woman who's emotionally preoccupied with her ex or is married to her career or et cetera, et cetera. It's like you can only have certain types of relationships with certain people. And to my mind, it's more important to weed out the problems than to really try to optimize for the benefits. Because I think that you can have satisfying relationships with lots of different people. The pain is more painful than pleasure is pleasurable. So it's more important to kind of use your filtering process to not get too engaged with women who are going to be difficult and problematic to have the kind of relationship you would like to have with them. And this has to do with kind of like testing, right? You have to be kind of a detective here because you can't just like ask, are you a difficult woman? No woman is really going to say that. She is. But there are clearly a lot of difficult women out there. So you have to not rely on direct questioning. You have to be more like a detective and observant. And in particular for men, you have to not let your attraction guide your perception. Another reason why so many guys get into unsatisfying relationships is they've just decided she's the one I want. And before they even have any kind of adequate data or information on this person. And so they're already leading with their attraction. And so they're going to minimize or even ignore the negative attributes that they see. And they're going to focus exclusively and amplify the positive things that they see, generally how attractive she is. And that's a problem. This is why I counsel men to kind of keep a tight rein on their emotions for at least 6 months throughout the dating process, probably closer to 12 if you're vetting for a long-term relationship, to be honest. This is because if a woman is dating you for 6 months, she likes you. She wants to be in a relationship with you. She wouldn't be sticking around that long. And because she wants that, just like the employer who wants the job, she's going to be not necessarily lying to you, but showing you what she thinks you want to see. The issue is that people can't keep that up indefinitely. Like how people show up for interviews are not how they show up to work 3 years down the road once they have the job, not at all. And that person 3 years down the road is who you actually hire more than the polished, polite, responsible individual who still hasn't gotten what she wants in the job interview. So it's important not to invest until you start to see how she does on the job on some level. That's the best test, is just like in a professional context, don't ask them riddles, don't ask them direct questions, ask them to do the job that you want to hire them to do. You can't really fake that. It's like if you were auditioning for a concert, they wouldn't ask you about your opinions about Verdi. You would play a piece and people would evaluate how well you performed. And you would get the job more or less on the virtue of that performance. Like that works. It's very hard to cheat that. So if you want a certain type of relationship with a woman, then try to get her to do that as soon in the courtship process as possible. So like if you actually want a more traditional woman, as some guys do, who wants to like cook and clean, don't wait until 3 years down the road when you're married to ask her to do that, because that's not what she fucking signed up for. And she very likely isn't interested in doing that. And there's going to be some women who are like, oh, I like doing that. Not all women, but if that's truly important to you and that's the kind of relationship you want to have, you should give those women a chance to self-select out of this process as early as possible. And that's going to leave you with fewer women, but the women who remain are going to be enthusiastically interested in the type of relationship you're willing to give her. That works for everybody. So don't hide. You can't lead with certain things, but you also can't hide certain things. It's a bit of a dance.
It really resonated with me about how you said in one of your videos that men often will over-exaggerate in the dating process, and they will, for example, take a woman to a very extravagant restaurant.
Oh, sure. They're trying to impress her.
In an attempt to impress her when that's not an actual representation of their life. So how do you balance that dance, as you mentioned, of creating that emotional experience versus also being realistic?
Well, sure, yeah, because it's not about fancy dinners. Now, there's some people, because they're foodies, because they make a lot of money, they go to Michelin star restaurants every week. And if that's you, then you can, I mean, that sounds like a nice life. You can continue to do that with the women that you bring into your life. That's not extraordinary. That's your life. That said, that's not how most men operate. So I don't care who you are, but like 90% of your relationship with a woman over the long term is probably going to be talking to each other and just like spending time around the house together. I think that's personally what I've done, is like the second date was always dinner at my house that we would cook together. I'm not somebody who likes to go out to the clubs, and I don't party and things like that. I like quiet, peaceful time at home. And that's what I enjoy doing with my girlfriends. I like cooking, I like talking, I like connecting, I like cuddling on the couch, I like having sex. It's like, that's what I want to do. I hope I can do that indefinitely with the women that I like, you know? So that's going to work for some women, and some women are going to be like, no, that sounds really boring. It's like, great, you saved us both a lot of time. But because I'm that way, I'm not going to pretend that, we're going to go to some concerts, or we're going to go on a hot air balloon ride or some shit like that. Yeah. Like, I invite them into my life as quickly as possible so that they can make a decision whether they feel comfortable there or not. And if they balk at that, it's like, great. I don't feel comfortable going to a man's house. No problem, sweetheart. Not an issue. But that's the end of the interview. It's like, you have to come into the office if you want the job. That's
a good way of looking at it, in that people self-selecting is good for both parties.
You absolutely want to do that. It's going to, and a lot of men are loath to do that because women will opt out. They will. I barely know you. I can't go to a man's house, or that's not appropriate, and they'll lead in another direction about what they want. I think it'd be more appropriate if you took me out to dinner. I'm like, no, I don't really do that. Certainly, maybe once you're my girlfriend, but that's not what I do at this stage of the game. So, and that doesn't work for her, no problem. There's going to be another guy who's going to be willing to buy her dinner.
At what point should people get married?
I mean, help me understand the question a little bit more.
I guess to rephrase, after what period of time in dating should people consider getting married?
Okay, that makes a little bit more sense. The first question, it still has the assumption that people should get married, which I don't agree with. Like, we should get rid of marriage, and marriage is this evil, bad institution. No, I'm not that way either. But to say that like people should get married, and that's the inevitable, appropriate terminus of all relationships, and any relationship that doesn't end in marriage is somehow a failure. It's like, that's stupid and insane too. It's very clear that marriage isn't working for a lot of people. The issue is we haven't come up with any kind of really compelling alternatives to marriage. And so it's like we have this all or nothing mentality. It's either the relationship fits on this escalator where it's like you date, you move in, you get engaged, you get married, or it's nothing at all, or you're just a player, you're lonely, or you're having these really short-term disposable relationships. And I don't think that works for a lot of people, and I don't fucking think this works for a lot of people either. And I do think we're in a stage where when things are falling apart, we don't necessarily have to just build them back up the way they used to be or throw them out altogether. We can keep certain things and also begin to experiment and iterate with the idea that different types of relationships are going to work for different people. Fucking yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. So I'll respond to the first question like that, is we shouldn't assume that marriage should be the terminus of all relationships, nor should we believe that any relationship that doesn't end in that is somehow exploitative, weird, disrespectful, failure. I don't think that's true. Mm-hmm. Now, if both people do want to get married, I would think at the bare minimum, you'd want to date for at least a year. That sounds reasonable. I mean, no one gets married to get divorced. If people get married, they think they're going to spend the rest of their lives together. People generally get married, 29 is the average, I think, in the US. People are living to close to 80. That's 50 years. What's 1 year for 50? That's 2% of your time. It's like that's a non-significant amount of time. What's the threshold of significance? 5%? So that would be 2.5 years to vet a 50-year marriage. Mm-hmm. So I think that people should really get along. Like, there is no magic ring. The idea that once I give this ring, our problems will be solved, or she'll like me more, or she won't leave, or he'll be loyal, like those things aren't true. So a ring should be, if it's given, it should be a recognition of a relationship that's already working, as opposed to like a hope that this will transform the relationship for the better.
Mm-hmm. One issue that a lot of guys face is losing attraction later on in a long-term relationship.
To the woman, or the woman's losing attraction for him?
The woman losing attraction to him. Mm. How can guys maintain attraction in a long-term relationship?
Oh, there's lots of things that you can do. First of all, you have to continue on some level to do the things that attracted her to begin with. Otherwise, it's kind of a bait and switch, right? If you used to be kind of this like dangerous motorcycle riding ne'er-do-well, and you sold the bike and now you work as an accountant, it's probably going to change how that woman feels about you, right? Mm-hmm. Now, people can change and people can mature, and things that they did at their 20s, they might not want to do in their 50s. I get that. But like, we have to continue to show up in the ways that stimulated our attraction from the very, very beginning. And that could mean, for men, making sure that you take care of your fitness. Like, too many guys fall off with that. They're overweight, but they're still expecting their wives to look good. I think that's not a great double standard. And in particular, to constantly be striving and growing. One of the most sexy attributes to a woman in a man is ambition or drive. And this is true even if they have a lot of money. So I think that a man should always be working towards something. And when he starts to coast or rest on his laurels or become complacent, then the attraction begins to decrease. Maybe not immediately, or at least not perceptibly, but over time it tends to go down. Mm-hmm. Other things that you can do to maintain attraction is to maintain some of the conditions that naturally existed when you were just dating. One thing in particular, it's very hard to maintain sexual frequency when you cohabitate. Like, it's not marriage that tends to reduce the frequency of sex, it's cohabitation, regardless of whether you have the contract or not. I don't think that men and women were designed to spend as much time with each other as men and women do in 2024. I think that throughout most of history, the women were over here with the other women and the children, the men were over here with the other men. Maybe they'd come together for a meal in the evenings, but often the guy was out on a hunting party, or he was a traveling salesman and he was on the road 200 days out of the year. The realms of men and women have never been as coincident as today. And I think that's had significant ramifications for our attraction with one another. There's a reason why people who grow up together don't become sexually attracted to each other. There's even a term for it. And the explanation is basically like, if you spend this much time with somebody, whether you're conscious of it or not, you kind of like treat them as if they're your sibling. They didn't have genetic testing throughout most of human history. So your sibling wasn't really who you were blood related to. It was somebody that you grew up with. It was someone you spent that kind of time with day in and day out. You no longer see that person as a sexual object. And that's good for genetic diversity, because if we just sleep with what's around us, then we tend to be inbred and unhealthy. So we tend to lose attraction for what's close. So one thing that men can do to maintain attraction long term is to not collapse that distance that existed when you were just dating each other. Maybe you don't even live together. I know that's a wild idea. And people might think, well, what's wrong with your relationship that you don't live with each other? It's like, maybe that's for the best. I know a couple of very happy, apparently, relationships that they don't live together, and it works for both of them. So to get out of the house, to have some separation, to not be in constant contact with one another. If I know everything about your day, then what am I going to talk about when I come home and we have dinner together? It's like you're already a known entity. That's boring. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be some sort of uncertainty. There needs to be some sort of unknown, some mystery, some space. Space is like air to a fire. Space is to passion as air is to fire. Without that, it just becomes this like smothering pile of ashes. Mm-hmm. So those are some things that you can do. Continue to work on yourself, take care of your fitness, and try to recreate as much as possible the conditions that led to the fun, attractive phase of your courtship.
Mm-hmm. I think this often gets more difficult for guys when you take the relationship in the far long term and say they're married, they have kids, and there are a lot of responsibilities at home that they need to take care of. Mm-hmm. So how would you go about that? And what do you think, for example, in your experience, is a normal amount of time to be spending with your significant other?
Kids do seem to be a game changer. I don't have kids of my own, so I'm not going to be speaking in my personal experience on this one. I do, according to the research that I have read from folks who seem to know more about this than I do, it's really important for the marriage to be the primary relationship in the house, that the relationship between the husband and the wife is the primary, most important dynamic. And I think a lot of marriages come into trouble because the children become the most important. And sometimes that even tends to triangulate one parent against the other. It's usually often the mother and a child on one side and the dad over here. You know, I know some relationships where the dad's been sleeping on the couch, on his own couch for months, and the mom is sleeping in the bed with the child. So it's like the child has now disrupted the dynamic between mother and father, husband and wife. And that's going to cause long-term consequences, probably to the child more than anything, and to the marriage secondarily. So again, I don't remember this being the case when I was a kid, but so often today I go to friends and family's house that they have young kids, and it's like the kids own the whole house. Like I get how difficult it must be to be a parent, but if the living room looks like the playpen, the kitchen looks like the playpen looks like the playpen, it's like the children are now the most important beings in that house. Mm-hmm. And that is like 12th night. It's a disruption of the natural order of things. And I think modern parents have moved a little too far away against appropriate discipline. They want to be like friends with and buddies with their kids sometimes. They want their kids to like them. And to be a good parent, you can't always be liked. You have to sometimes be the bad guy. You have to sometimes do the thing that is going to make the kid cry or hurt their feelings because it's in their long-term best interests. And without that kind of discipline, without those sort of generational boundaries, without giving the marriage its primacy, the family becomes chaotic and disordered. The children might become, it's not that they become narcissistic, it's that they are narcissistic and they're not disabused of their narcissism for longer periods of time, which causes difficulties for them. And the marriage tends to suffer. So I think that some of those things are addressable. I don't think that they're easy to do. Raising kids seems like a lot of work, but and so I am a little bit of an armchair quarterback here, but it seems like some of those things might be in everyone's best interest to remember.
Mm-hmm. What's the concept of frame in a relationship, and how should guys approach this?
Frame is just sort of like what you do in the relationship. Like, what's the structure? How often do we see each other? When we see each other, who goes to whom? What are we doing when we get together? What are the rules of the relationship? What is this relationship designed to accomplish? All those questions are related to frame. The person who controls the frame generally gets more of what he or she wants. And the person who controls the frame is the person with more power in the dynamic. And in most relationships I know, it's the woman who controls the frame. The woman is more powerful than the man. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't seem to be, I'm sure that works out for some people, but it doesn't seem to be working out for a lot of people. And that could also be part of why a lot of marriages and relationships are failing.
How should guys find a balance between giving their women what they want and making them happy versus giving in too much?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a tricky balance. If you never give the other person what they want, they might stick around for a while, but then they'll eventually get sick of waiting and they'll go find somebody else. Mm-hmm. But if you always give somebody what they want, especially right away, they're not often going to appreciate it. They might even become entitled, and that can lead to bad outcomes in that relationship. So I think it's a balance. In general, this is going to sound weird, but I think it's true psychologically. In general, people are happier when they're abiding in the hope of getting what they want more than when they actually get what they want. Getting what you want feels really good in the moment. It feels very satisfying. And then that moment passes and you're like, what's the next thing? Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but it took me about 7 years between when I applied to grad school and I finally got my license, right? And when I finally did it, I felt so good and proud and accomplished for like a week. And then it was like, okay, now what? I can't just be coasting on the fact that I'm a doctor or a licensed psychologist now. There's another challenge, there's another hill to climb, right? Mm-hmm. I've had that great meal. I don't sit there thinking about the great meal I had yesterday. I'm hungry today. So for better or worse, people generally have short memories for these kinds of things. It's satisfying to get what they want, but they actually tend to be happier when they want something they don't yet have, but they feel like they're making progress towards its attainment. Mm-hmm. People are more happy climbing the hill than they are at the top enjoying the vista. Because how long can you really sit up there? Yeah, it's pretty, but it's also cold. There's nothing to do. And eventually you're going to have to come down if you want to go anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what is important in long-term relationships is that kind of management, is to make sure that there's always new things that the other person wants and doesn't yet have.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it.
And then you give them to them overall, because if they despair of ever getting it, they're going to get pissed off. Even more so, they'll feel betrayed and irate, and maybe that's justified on some level. But if you give them right away, it's like you're going to run out of things to give them pretty soon. And then when they're out of things that they can get, why would they stick around? You'd either have to be the most attractive person that they could possibly get, or they have to have a deep love for you that would basically mean if I left you, I would be so hurt and broken that I'm willing to just forego getting what I want now to avoid that potential pain.
That's a good way of thinking about it. Continuing to have that thing to look forward to.
You need to have something to look forward to that the other person wants to get. So don't give them away too fast unless you have a million things that they want and you have at your disposal. Then I guess you can give them away hard and fast. Mm-hmm. But most people don't.
Yeah. One thing you talk about in your videos that poses a challenge to marriage or long-term relationships is that people put too much pressure on the relationship or for the person to fulfill so many different roles. Mm-hmm. How should people go about looking at that?
Yeah, I talk about this in the book, and I've made some episodes on the subject. I think the reason why most marriages fail is that we want that partner to be too many people. That throughout most of human history, we've lived in small communities or tribes where the men had a bunch of other men to do things with, and the women had a bunch of other women to talk to, and they had a whole community of relatives and acquaintances and neighbors to get their needs met and to relate to. And we don't live in those tribes or communities anymore. We don't live in intergenerational housing. Like my family lives on the other side of the country. We have the nuclear situation where it's just one man and one woman trying to raise kids by themselves. It's very, very difficult. And so because of that, it's like we still need and want things from other people, but we, for some reason, expect and feel justified in receiving all of those things from our romantic partner, which I think is just nutty. So, for example, we might want our partner to be, our soulmate, but you might also want them to be our sexy mistress and playmate. We might want them to be our co-business partner, either because we're starting a business together or we're running the business of the household together. We might want them to be our cheerleader who's always there to emotionally support us, or our therapist who can listen to our troubles and give selfless, empathic advice, or the mommy and daddy that we never had or didn't get when we were younger, or a chauffeur or a maid or a chef. It's like there's so many things that people want, and it's very difficult to get even one person who's good at any one of those things. Like, how hard is it to find a good therapist? Period. How hard is it to find a good XYZ? So it's like to expect that you're going to get all 10 of those or 15 of those things in one person. That's very strange to me, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think that we need to. We certainly haven't had to do that throughout most of human history. We would go to the cheerleaders for the cheerleaders. We'd go to our uncle for a sage advice, and we'd have our mistress for the hot, sexy times. This all started with the love marriage. Throughout most of human history, people did not marry for love. It was more of a business transaction, generally between the families involved. And it was like a necessary social construct where it's like, okay, we need more people to replace the population. Your second son will marry our third daughter, and she comes with these sheep, and he comes with these land, and it's going to be a practical arrangement. And they seem to be, they could do well together, and it'll be an alliance, and they'll be able to raise kids because they have the resources and the support to do so. Love doesn't really enter into the equation at all. But as soon as we started to come into the idea of love marriage, which generally happened as a nation becomes more industrialized, people often think that my economic model of relationships, where everything, it like commodifies people and everything is bought and sold, that's a real symptom of late stage capitalism. And that's how deeply our structure of society has infiltrated our hearts. And I don't think that that's true, because transactional relationships, arranged marriages, we see them in agrarian societies. It's as countries and cultures become more industrialized and capitalistic that love marriages become more and more prevalent. You never see it go the other way, ever. And I think the reason for that is because capitalism tends to lift people out of poverty. It has its issues for sure, but the more that we embrace some of these economic realities, the higher the quality of life is for more people on this planet. When we get them out of need, remember, most marriages happen through need, we're now into want, which is more about desire. So nobody needs a marriage. They want a marriage, and they're not going to get married unless they love that person, right? So that creates another issue, because what works for raising kids, which is fun, and having that like small business of a household, which is generally what marriage has been for thousands of years, is very different from what feels good and is desirable. Those two things often have nothing to do with one another. When we tried to wife up the mistress, we made the mistress the wife and the wife the mistress, then we ran into trouble. And that's just 2 roles. I mentioned like 10 a few minutes ago. So we want too many things from one person. And I think that people will continue to need and want things, but why not get those needs and wants met through a diversity of relationships? It takes a lot of the pressure and expectation off of it's supposed to be the primary relationship, not the only relationship. And a lot of people, it's like the only thing that they have. Mm-hmm. Maybe they go to work and they come home to the wife. Repeat. And then 30 years go by.
Yeah. So how should guys make sure that their needs get met outside the relationship?
To continue to invest in relationships outside of that woman. And in particular, it's very important for men to invest in their male friendships. Most men do not have many male friends. They might have them on paper, but like I see my good friends like once or twice a year, not because I wouldn't want to see them sooner, but on some level, I'm like the 7th priority in their lives. And I might be generous, Because think about it. This is how guys think, maybe organically, maybe because of cultural programming, but like hanging out with me, they're not going to get laid. They're not going to get paid. They're not going to like get something of use to benefit their children or their careers. There's nothing useful about hanging out with me. It's just fun. It's just nice to be able to like connect and share some moments with your buddies. But that's opportunity cost seems really high when there are women, when there are children, and when we live in a society where the women really value certain attributes and resources in men. Like no woman is like, I hope one day I can find a guy who just loves hanging out with his buddies 5 nights a week. It's like, no woman wants that. Like, what is the thing that stereotypically women hate the most about men in today's day and age? Like something that a lot of guys do, but women are just like, why do you spend so much time doing that? Like, what is that about?
Probably watching the game with the buddies.
Well, they probably not even have buddies, but there's been a study that came out recently, I think it was out of Oxford, that said men need 2 guys' nights a week in order to have like optimal mental and emotional health. 2 nights a week with your buddies. I get like 2 times a year with my buddies. You know what I'm saying? Because they're so busy working their jobs and making money and then providing for their wife and children. There's not any time left. So what I was fishing for is video games. Women hate video games. They often don't like it when the man works too much, but they're often not going to stand in the way because they indirectly benefit from that. Like he's out there slaying the dragon, advancing his career, making more money. She can benefit from that indirectly as long as she's in relationship with him. I think a lot of women look at this and it's just like, there's nothing about video games that directly or indirectly I can benefit from. Fuck the fact that the guy just likes to do it. But again, just like hanging out with me, it doesn't get him laid. It doesn't get him paid. It doesn't advance his career. He just does it because it's fun to do. God forbid, you know? And I do think that a lot of women need to watch this, that some women, for whatever reason, they kind of feel like when a guy isn't working, like she is entitled to all of his free time. Like if he's not using it for his job or his earning, like he should be giving it to her. And that when he plays video games, it's taking time away from her. Like that time that she was entitled to, or when he's hanging out with his buddies, it's taking time away from her. And I think that's just really narcissistic. I don't think that women should assume that any time, they shouldn't assume that they're entitled to any time in anybody's life, let alone the man that they profess to love. You know what I'm saying? It's like, if they loved him, they would want what's best for him. They would want him to be happy. And certainly video games can sometimes make them happy. Hanging out with their friends can sometimes make them happy. Being the fuck away from them can sometimes make them happy. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's impactful. I think this has been a really productive conversation.
Oh yeah, we done? Ryan. I guess we've been talking for a while, huh?
Yeah. So I want to put a plug in for Ryan's book, The Value of Others, which I read recently and is a great read.
Oh, thanks, man.
You really hit the nail on the head. Where can people find you?
You can find me on YouTube, Psych Hacks. That is my channel. The book is available on Amazon. It's paperback, ebook, and audiobook. I have a members community that I launched recently. It's called the Captain's Quarters, where I give bi-monthly group consultations with the men and women who enroll, as well as have invited guests onto my channel. It's been a lot of fun. So that's kind of where you can find me.
That's awesome. I'll put those links in the description below. Thanks for being on the show.
You're welcome, Bill. It was great. Thank you.